Welcome back, everyone. We're here again broadcasting from our studio, finally, here in New York. We have a great lineup today. We're going to be talking first off about Trump saying he's going to be mobilizing the U.S. military and sending it into different states where they have these riots if the local governors refuse to mobilize the National Guard in large numbers. We're also going to be going into some of these different videos that we've seen that allegedly show possible weapons, stacks of bricks being left apparently for protesters, and some of the different police departments and organizations saying that it appears these protests are being planned ahead of time, that violence is being planned ahead of time. We're also going to be explaining the above and below tactic, the method that subversive movements use to subvert otherwise legitimate movements like this. Now that said, folks, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, really need your help supporting this channel. And also, if you've already subscribed, please don't forget to double check and make sure you're still subscribed, because we get several people saying that they apparently are being unsubscribed by YouTube. And also, if you want to go the extra mile, please also tell a friend about this channel, let others know about it. Now let's jump into it. So first off, we're going to be talking about how Trump has called on governors to deploy the National Guard in large numbers. And in places where they refuse to do so, he's going to be sending in the U.S. military. At least that's what he's saying. So first off, Trump spoke in the Rose Garden on June 1st. Here's a clip of what he said here.
My administration is fully committed that for George and his family, justice will be served. He will not have died in vain. But we cannot allow the righteous cries and peaceful protesters to be drowned out by an angry mob. The biggest victims of the rioting are peace-loving citizens in our poorest communities. And as their president, I will fight to keep them safe.
Now, when it comes to the subversive movements allegedly trying to take hold of this whole protest, here's what Trump said. He defined them. He attributes the riots, the violent part of these protests, to, quote, professional anarchists, violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others. Here's a clip of what he said.
But in recent days, our nation has been gripped by professional anarchists, violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others.
And then he goes into the, say, bigger picture of what has been happening. Now, of course, we've seen videos of some of the peaceful sides of this protest. Actually, we'll be showing some clips from some of Epoch Times reporters on the ground in some of these protests of people actually cleaning up their communities. There are many people who are acting peacefully amidst all of this. But Trump points to some of the violence that has taken place. I'm sure some of you have seen the videos. For example, this woman who was allegedly very brutally beaten outside of her store in northern New York, for example, beaten with looked like pieces of wood. Her husband comes out, tries to stop it. The killing of this U.S. federal agent, different forms of violence we've seen taking place. Now, Trump talks about these issues, and here's what he said here.
Small business owners have seen their dreams utterly destroyed. New York's finest have been hit in the face with bricks. Brave nurses who have battled the virus are afraid to leave their homes. A police precinct has been overrun. Here in the nation's capital, the Lincoln Memorial and the World War II Memorial have been vandalized. One of our most historic churches was set ablaze. A federal officer in California, an African-American enforcement hero, was shot and killed.
Trump says, quote, these are not acts of peaceful protest, in reference to what he just said. He said, these are acts of domestic terror. And he continues, the destruction of innocent life and the spilling of innocent blood is an offense to humanity and a crime against God. Now, this is a very strong approach by Trump when it comes to sending in the military. Just a bit of my own analysis on this. Let me go into this. Now, in New York, for example, just came out, Mayor Bill de Blasio is saying that he will not be rallying up the National Guard. He doesn't think it's necessary.
A National Guard, a member of the Guard called up from any part of this state, doesn't have that particular training, doesn't know our environment, but is carrying a loaded weapon. That is a bad scenario.
And so we'll see what happens with Trump now. Is Trump going to send in the U.S. military into New York City? And that's, of course, where we're based here. The National Guard is basically the different militias, the state militias. It is not federal. And so each state has its own National Guard, its own personal military. The governors of each state are able to call in the National Guard as they see fit. I mean, if it's legal, of course. And so it wouldn't really be on Trump to call in the National Guard. Again, it's on the governors. What Trump can call on, though, is the U.S. military, and he can do it under the pretext that there is a threat to the entire nation, which he's invoking that now with these current riots. Now, it's interesting what's happening in New York right now, because if more like Cuomo, but de Blasio, someone commenting on it, if New York were to call in the National Guard, any kind of, say, misuse, any kind of, say, shooting, any kind of scandal would fall on the shoulders and the heads of the local politicians here. If Trump calls in the military, in other words, if the local government here refuses to do so and Trump calls it in, then it is on him. Anything that happens is on him. And so it would be very hard for them to use, let's say, incidents, chaos on the streets, different things we see taking place to attack Trump if it were the local governments calling in the National Guard. Whereas if it is Trump calling in the military, then they can use this for their own propaganda. Now, it's unclear whether this is, local officials legitimately agree that the National Guard is not needed. Of course, New York has seen some pretty heavy violence, including cars driving through groups of police officers, including shootings, including beatings, including pretty large-scale looting of Fifth Avenue, different attacks in different stores here, and pretty serious incidents if you go around the town. Also, they're having an 8 p.m. curfew now. So obviously, New York does recognize this as, at least we could say, a security threat. They are recognizing that there are problems taking place with this, but for some reason refusing to call in the National Guard. They don't think it's necessary. Now, we can expect that as Trump moves forward with this pretty major response to this incident, he's going to be criticized for it. And this is one of the big issues, I think, that a lot of the country is going to be watching, because really this whole incident, this whole protest or riot, whatever you want to call it, is being taken in context of the 2020 elections. Just like the virus, the coronavirus, is being taken in context of the 2020 elections. Things that happen right now could impact the outcome of the elections. And so we're seeing governments put their cards on the table. We're seeing different political factions put their cards on the table. And here's what the bet is. The left, many of the Democrats, are getting behind the protesters. They're getting behind even Antifa, some of them, in fact. Now, they're putting their cards behind the idea, this idea, that what Americans care most about is social justice, that what Americans care most about is race politics, that the things that we saw pretty much throughout the whole Obama administration, the different issues that were pushed, the different ideas that were pushed, are something that could grasp and, say, impact the outcome of an election, that can grasp the American conscience, the public conscience, more so than anything else. And that the imagery that they could paint Trump as being a dictator, that they could paint him as taking too harsh of a stance during this time in his response to these protests, they are putting their cards on the table that itself could very likely win the elections. They're getting behind that idea. The Trump administration is putting its cards in a different way. They're putting their cards behind the idea that what Americans care more about is personal safety. What they care more about is the safety of their businesses, the safety of their finances, the safety of their homes, and also the protection of their personal property. When it comes to what we're seeing in New York right now, in particular in other parts of the U.S., where people are having their businesses burned down, where people are having their livelihoods destroyed, where people are having their homes sometimes attacked, the Trump administration is putting their cards on the table that is what people care more about, and taking a harsh response, taking a very strong response, arguably one of the strongest you could possibly take, sending in the U.S. military to deal with an issue like this. Next up, we're going to go over some of the situation on the ground in different parts of the U.S. Now, first off, there's, of course, a lot of videos of violence, a lot of videos of, say, pretty serious violence, as a matter of fact. One of them we have here is a car driving through a group of police.
رأس العساكر أنا أنيكم واخي معطلك قول 10 عساكر.
And so there again we had, some violence against police officers. Other places it seems people very much support the police. The Trump administration is sending in riot police to different areas. Now this is a video from Crown Heights in Brooklyn, New York, where residents are cheering as these different police officers dressed in riot gear are marching through their towns. Jump into that now. Now, in different parts of the U.S., the police have acted differently as well. Some parts of the U.S., you have police officers apparently standing down, apparently saying they're not going to be enforcing different laws to protect, say, personal property. They're not going to be putting officers' lives on the line to protect businesses and possessions. Many people are saying that not protecting personal property is, say, going against one of the basic ideas of policing, that they should be protecting personal property. But when it comes to protecting lives and the lives of police, some of them are saying that, well, that's more important. Some of them are also getting behind the protesters. There's different things all throughout the U.S. We won't be going into all of this, but there's different takes on it depending on where you're at. Also, in some communities, there are peaceful protesters who are taking a very different stance on the protests. We've all seen videos of the riots. We've all seen videos of the violence. Maybe not everyone's seen some of the better things happening in the U.S. Now, Epoch Times reporter Charlotte Cuthbertson, actually from New Zealand, she's a U.S. citizen now, one of our really good reporters. She does a lot of our crisis reporting. She's on the ground now, and she has a video of a massive community cleanup effort at a Wendy's. Now, people have told her, she said, that it's not organized. In other words, this cleanup effort is not being organized. And they just turned up to help. This is in Minneapolis, not far from the 3rd Precinct police station, which was set on fire. And so this is the other face of the protest, I think, that we're not seeing as much of. Good people coming together on a very grassroots scale to make a difference and to clean things up, set things right. Another video from Charlotte, graffiti cleanup crew. Again, they said everyone just turned up. This was not organized. Everyone just turned up to clean things up. Many of these people are from other neighborhoods. That's what they told her, at least. Now, here's also another video. Peaceful protesters handing over a man to police who was trying to destroy the sidewalk. And so again, if we look at the whole picture here, we're seeing different types of protests taking place. There are peaceful protests. There are people legitimately protesting. There are people coming together as communities trying to make a difference. There are people showing their support or their unhappiness, is maybe a nice way to put it, in different ways when it comes to what's going on. The Trump administration is focused not on the peaceful protesters, but on the people who they believe have subverted these protests to use them for violent revolution, for violent subversion. And so that's the, say, different faces of this issue that we're facing right now as a nation. I think it's very unfortunate that all of these different groups are being, say, placed into the same container when it comes down to it. A lot of news outlets aren't really drawing a line between the different faces of the protest. There are very, very, very different faces of it. And again, with these, you see people, all races, coming together in different ways, whether they support the protesters, whether they do not. And also, again, even individuals who are protesting, standing up against the violent protesters or the destructive protesters. In other words, people who are protesting right now against this, death of this black man who died in police custody while being arrested. There are different takes on it. Just because they're protesting doesn't mean they support violence. Just because they're protesting doesn't mean they support destruction of their cities. Now, that said, let's go into some of the issues we've seen as well. Now, there are many, many videos on the ground and even different government officials in different parts of the U.S. saying that they're finding weapons caches apparently being left at sites where protests are being held. And it does appear that there are groups trying to use this. There are groups planning violence ahead of time. At least that's the belief. And so let's look at some of these different videos now. First off, in New York City, the Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism, John Miller, said there is a high level of confidence within the NYPD that these unnamed groups had organized scouts, medics, and supply routes of rocks, bottles, and accelerants for breakaway groups to commit vandalism and violence. He continued, there are strong indicators they plan for violence in advance, using at times encrypted communications. So again, there are the grassroots protests, the peaceful ones, and there are the violent protests, planned and very well organized. Moving on, this is in Dallas. We have here a video. There's an individual says, I believe this was a setup. Those bricks are up on the street, or up the street from some very expensive shops in downtown Dallas. Let's show this video now.
This right here?
Yeah, they put them there.
This the setup.
They put them there on purpose,
Y'all know
bro.
where we at.
They gonna set them hoes right up on the route of.
Y'all know what building this is
Come
right
on
here.
now.
I ain't even gonna say what name it is.
Yeah, where do them bricks go to? Where do them
This
bricks
is
go
set
to?
up.
And so again, a clip showing the white protester, black protester, legitimate protesters seeing what they believe to be a setup for violent protests, organized violent protests. Again, different faces of what we're seeing right now, and people not happy. Even people who are supporting the protests not happy with individuals who appear to be planning violence and planning destruction. Moving on to Minneapolis, something very similar happened. We'll jump into this clip now as well. Public Safety Commissioner John Harrington reported Sunday evening that law enforcement officers have located incendiary and flammable materials. And so again, very likely evidence that these arsons, this lighting on fire of buildings, was planned by different groups. Videos continue to surface showing protesters stumbling upon pallets of bricks or pavers in areas with no construction taking place. If there's no construction, what are the bricks for? Now, we also have a video here. It says, white people rolling up, handing black men bricks to throw during the protests. Glad a black woman was there to set the expletives straight. This is the clip we're seeing here. This is a car apparently of white individuals who appear to be Antifa-like individuals, dressed as such at least, kind of scrawny-looking white guys, handing out bricks to people who are black. And this woman's very offended. This woman's very offended that they did that. She gives the brick back to them and yells at them, and they actually look pretty apologetic that they did so. They seem like they are realizing maybe the shame in what they just did. Now, Trump himself posted a video, and he's saying this is an individual suspected of paying people to direct protesters. We'll show Trump's tweet now.
Go get everything you can find. Go get everything you can find. These are the boys right here. This is the team. There's more stuff that we can put out here. Hey, there's 3 picnic tables up here. There's a couple picnic tables up here. Let's go on. Come on, y'all.
Now, we can't confirm what that individual was doing. Maybe they were friends, maybe he owed him money, maybe he was giving him money for legitimate reasons. But an individual who's dressed like these black bloc protesters, giving money to an individual and apparently giving him orders and directions for some kind of planning. It does appear that there is coordination, it does appear there is planning. Is this grassroots? Well, it's happening in enough places of the U.S. where we can assume that there's at least some degree of coordination. Now, moving on. OC Antifa is a Twitter account, and allegedly an Antifa Twitter account, came out and announced that they are not, in fact, an Antifa Twitter account, but instead the whole time was a fake account that spent 3 years infiltrating Antifa. Now, notably, Twitter actually suspended this account soon after it came out and made this announcement, but there are archives of it still in place, and here's what they said. I'll read it now. It says, "Attention Antifa, quote, comrades. Today marks the end of an almost 3-year operation. Our infiltration of your movement was a success, and the faces and identities of everyone who has attended or financially supported Marxist and seditious activities has been recorded. The countless patriots whose lives you have ruined and families you have terrorized will finally be avenged. No longer will the American people tolerate your red terror and subversion of everything we hold dear. We have identified dozens of militants and sympathizers in local politics and academia, including professors at University of California, Irvine, and local DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, officials. The reckoning is here, and you are all going to feel the wrath of a nation who has finally had enough of your games. Enjoy prison." Now, unclear again whether this is legitimate, unclear whether they have because they did not post anything yet, but this account was suspended by Twitter after it posted this. And if there's telling the truth, actually, this does align with some of the information we've been seeing. Notably here, they mentioned DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. In our previous episode, we actually noted how DSA put out a notice on its own websites talking about how it had formed, ahead of these protests, a national system to organize nationally anti-fascist, Antifa in other words, operations. Now moving on to the bigger picture, what we're seeing here. Let's talk about the above and below strategy. And what is this? Now I'll read some quotes here. I had done some articles on this previously, some analysis, and I'll be reading a couple of quotes I had from that story, and then I'll be going into some of the bigger picture stuff with how this thing actually works. So what is the above and below tactic? This is how different subversive movements, and even governments sometimes, create imagery, create incidents, and then use government to respond, government or media, to respond to these incidents, and how they advance that image to create, say, different laws, different conditions in society, or different outcomes that suit their needs. This is the strategy that they use to do this. This is a quote from authors David Horowitz and Richard Poe in their book Shadow Party. Radicals in the government would then exert pressure from above. So in other words, first off, you have the grassroots protesters creating incidents on the street that gather the public attention. Then it says radicals in the government would then exert pressure from above, enacting new laws on the pretext of appeasing the protesters in the street, even though the protesters, or at least their leaders, were themselves part of the plot. And it continues, quote, the majority of the people would have no idea what was going on. Squeezed from above and below, most would sink into apathy and despair, believing they were hopelessly outnumbered by the radicals, even though they were not. And through this method, Horowitz and Poe write, a small radical group can impose its will on a majority of people who are politically moderate, even under a democratic parliamentary system. And so this works on a very simple principle. You create chaos, and then you use the demand for, say, order to create new systems of power. You, in other words, rally up grassroots movements. You make it appear that there's, for example, a protest. You make it appear that there's a riot. You make it appear there's demand for change. And then you use your above tactic, the government level tactic, to create the change that they demand in a way that benefits both parties. These things can be coordinated. And when we have DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, directly involved in these protests, and different subversive movements that do in fact have their own political goals, we can at very least say that different political factions are engaged in this, and that their goals are different from the grassroots protesters. Their goals are not, in other words, just about, say, protesting because they're unhappy about something. Their goals for protesting are political change that they had wanted even prior to all of this. And so they are using the protests to, say, give reason to create these different social changes that they have been demanding. Some of that may be, again, playing into the 2020 elections, which are just around the corner for U.S. president, and how they can create incidents to use for propaganda, to use for talking points during that. Again, this is just analysis. Can't say for sure this is what these groups are doing. This is just analysis. Take it for what it is. Now, when it comes to, again, destabilizing, you create demand for a solution, and then use that demand to create a permanent change. Now, let's go into some of the bigger picture of all of this. A lot of people in the U.S., they understand socialism only as economic socialism. They understand communism only as economic communism, when in fact there are many different movements of this. Even going back to the time of Marx, in fact, there are many different movements of it. You had Christian socialism, you had military socialism, you had business socialism, things like the unions, things like the corporate reforms in the U.S. That a lot of times when people criticize capitalism, they're in fact criticizing the different forms of socialist intervention that has taken form within the capitalist system. For example, government subsidies of student loans, which means that prices for going to school rise through the roof. That basically filing for bankruptcy does not get rid of your student debt. That comes from government intervention in the in the university process. When it comes to medicine, high cost of medicine, of course, we can talk about how there's need for, say, Medicare for all and things like that. But a lot of the problem is the high cost of medicine, not from the institution that funds it. What happens when you fund it? You finance the corruption. You solidify the corruption in the society. There are grassroots changes in society. There are conflicts that take place in society. What is the outcome? Whatever the outcome is, you're going to have a winner and a loser. And so they look to subvert a process in motion and to divert the trajectory so that it serves their own political needs. And that seems to be what we're seeing here. Now that said, folks, agree with me, disagree with me, let me know in the comment section. You think I missed anything, let me know in the comment section as well. I do read them. Don't worry, I'm thick-skinned. I can take criticism, so let me know. That said, also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, really appreciate your support. Of course, folks, we're going to be broadcasting Monday through Friday, so please tune in. Of course, please take care of yourselves, stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you next time.